Hello, good evening. Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you all. Welcome to the second webinar of Muslims in Britain Research Group at Liverpool Hope University. So this research group draws on cross-disciplinary research, working collaboratively on various issues related to the challenges faced by British Muslims in 21st century Britain. The main aim of this group is to develop and share new ideas of research in this field, increase interdisciplinary research, identify areas of collaborative research, organize research seminars and conferences, and develop partnerships with major Muslim community organizations. Although we are based in Liverpool Hope University, our research group includes academics and postgraduate students in various disciplines and across different universities. Currently, our membership also includes colleagues from Liverpool, John Moores, Oxford, Manchester, and Cardiff universities. In the globalized world we live in today, where there is a high demand for information sharing that goes beyond the remit of one institution in a nation state, we have decided to make all our events online so that we can reach people around the world who would be interested to listen to our talks and events. We intend to organize research webinars, roundtables, and interviews online, and later upload them on our YouTube channel for people to access in their own time. We would appreciate moral support and constructive advice from our live and YouTube audiences. Please use the Q&A option here to post comments and ask questions. I'll go through them after the talk, and our guest will answer as many questions as possible. Let us now focus on our talk today. The title of today's webinar is Spatialized Islamophobia. Our guest speaker is Dr. Kauthar Najib, who is a lecturer in human geography at the University of Liverpool. Her research interests center on the geographies of inequality and discrimination using both quantitative and qualitative methods. She explores more broadly issues of social and spatial justice and was the principal researcher of the Spaces of Anti-Muslim Acts project, which highlights the impact of Islamophobic discrimination on space and people. She's the author of the book Spatialized Islamophobia, published in 2021 by Routledge, which brings increased recognition of geography and space in Islamophobia studies. Without further ado, I would now like to invite our guest speaker to begin her presentation. Yes, Kauthar.
Okay, so let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to present my work here for this Muslims in Britain Research Group webinar. I would like to thank Salman for this opportunity. I'm going to introduce myself very quickly. So I'm Kauthar Najib. I am a lecturer in human geography at the University of Liverpool in England, and I work on issues related to social and spatial inequalities. Before that, I was a Marie Curie Fellow at Newcastle University to work on the SAMA project, Spaces of Anti-Muslim Act. But I come from France. I studied my entire life in France. I have a PhD on residential segregation. And at some point, I had to move to an Anglo-American university to be able to study in good conditions such topics related to religious discrimination. I am also both a quantitative and qualitative researcher, so I often use a mixed methods approach, which usually helps me strengthen the results of my research. And for the study of spatialized Islamophobia, this approach has been essential. I'll come back to this later. My previous research in France was methodologically challenging because France does not recognize religious and cultural minorities and does not collect census data on race and religion. The French government refuses to identify ethnic and religious groups in order to not call into question the constitutional principle that the French people is one and indivisible. That's why, for example, my doctoral research on residential segregation centered only on social categories. Studies on racism and particularly on Islamophobia are therefore very marginalized in French academia, where there is no racial studies or religious studies department, making such research very challenging in France. So because of these challenges, I focused more on Anglo-American academic views that give an important place to study on minority groups, race, Muslim identity, etc. Besides, the issue of positionality and self-reflexivity are also more accepted in Anglo-American research and even valued, unlike the traditional scientific culture in France, which expect French researchers to be outsider and not involved with what they study. So as a researcher who is an insider to her research on discrimination, inequality, racism, I certainly felt frustrated by this French academic vision, and this frustration probably encouraged me to write this book. This is something I have explained quite deeply at the beginning of the book. I explained that it was the first time for me that I shared my positionality in my entire career because of my French academic background and training. Self-reflexivity is very little used in French academia and even rarer within the discipline of geography. Then I explained that being an insider and engage with what you study does not make a researcher less objective and neutral, as French academia claims, but on the contrary, it is an even greater guarantor of objectivity, especially when the research is about oppression, as many feminist researchers and others have already pointed out. And finally, I explained that I didn't want to let, in the name of objectivity and neutrality, the entire French scientific space to be occupied by outsider researchers. And as a French Moroccan geographer, and more exactly as a Muslim woman of color, I wanted to study Islamophobia. I wanted to combine geography and Islamophobia, and I wanted to write this book. That said, I have to make it clear that while my positionality and my experience within French academia were undoubtedly a motivation to write this book, they were not the main purpose of the book. The main purpose of the book is to show the spatialized and multiscalar nature of Islamophobia. The book highlights the need for an increased recognition of space in Islamophobia studies. Indeed, space, and especially public space, is at the center of concerns raised by the phenomenon of anti-Muslim rejection. Therefore, it is essential to bring space into Islamophobia studies, as well as to bring the study of Islamophobia into geography and try to extend this research area in significant ways within the discipline of geography. Other social science disciplines, such as sociology and political science, were the first to explore Islamophobia, often by referring it to systemic racism against Muslims and to a process of racialization that essentializes a group of highly diverse individuals under one single religious attribute. Within geography, Islamophobia was rather explored through the general study of Muslim identities and also focuses on the process of racialization. This conceptualization is appropriate, but geographers should be able to refine this definition by arguing that Islamophobia is also a spatialized process that occurs at different interrelated spatial scales, ranging from the globe to the body. This spatial dimension of Islamophobia was first introduced in a special issue of Social and Cultural Geography entitled Geographies of Islamophobia that I co-edited in 2020. And after this publication, I personally felt the need to develop the advanced concept of spatialized Islamophobia by offering this definition. Spatialized Islamophobia is a spatially pervasive form of anti-Muslim racism that occurs at various interrelated spatial scales: globe, nation, urban, neighborhood, and body and mind, and whose contours, effects, intensity, and functioning vary accordingly. I've always found it consistent that Islamophobia is a spatialized process that spares no spatial scale. And through the first chapter of my book, I was able to explain and illustrate the glocal process of spatialized Islamophobia by showing how Islamophobia projects a reality from the global scale to the local scale. This type of projection has already been shown by other researchers who work on, for example, social struggles, fears, and inequalities. And here, this global process particularly shows that the global fear of Islam has a direct impact on the way Muslim bodies can feel constrained in their everyday life, sense of security, mobility, behaviors, etc. This figure presents the funnel process of spatialized Islamophobia, but does not explain that this is only a one-way process. It is both a top-down and a bottom-up process. That is to say that the global negative representations can directly impact the way in which victims of Islamophobia perceive space emotionally, and vice versa, that this emotional geography of perceived risk can provoke claims that directly challenge the global stigmatization of Islam and Muslims, as well as the most beautiful promises embedded in our national constitutions. Obviously, there are many other interrelationships between the other spatial scales, as illustrated by the other dotted two-way arrows in this figure. And we can identify them in detail when reading the different chapters of the book. To study these interrelationships, I used both quantitative and qualitative methods of analysis. On the one hand, I explored the statistical databases I had access to, and on the other hand, I conducted individual interviews with victims of Islamophobia. So in Paris, I had access to the CCIF, Collective Against Islamophobia in France database that is shut down today, from where I collected georeferenced quantitative data in order to map all the Islamophobic acts that took place in Greater Paris. And for London, I had access to the Metropolitan Police data, as well as the databases from Association Fighting Against Islamophobia, like MEND and Telmama, for example. As for the qualitative data, they come from one-on-one interviews that I conducted with victims present in the databases of the CCIF for the Parisian case and MEND for the London case. The information collected allowed me to better understand how victims use spaces, which spaces they avoid, and how they dress and how they change their behaviors in certain places. Information that we cannot have with quantitative data. So for me, combining quantitative analysis, which allows us to bring out the general trends of a phenomenon, with qualitative evidence, which allows us to zoom in on more specific issues, bring complementary findings. And this approach definitely helped me to develop the concept of spatialized Islamophobia. So I have detailed the three main levels of scale: global and national Islamophobia, urban and infra-urban Islamophobia, and embodied and emotional Islamophobia. In these three chapters, I provide explanation of how Islamophobia is spatially defined and managed by uncovering the main types of spaces that are frequently submerged in the content of the existing literature on Islamophobia and very rarely considered all at once in one single book, as I have done here. According to the scale under study, the nature of Islamophobic act is different, just as the place where it happens is different, just as the persons involved are also different. It is as if almost everything changes from one spatial scale to another. Islamophobic act can range from racist discourses in global politics and national media to physical aggressions on the street. They can appear as a form of institutional discrimination in education or in the workplace, or even as a form of microaggressions at home. They can affect men or women and even children. And by showing all these different Islamophobias, my book necessarily relies on varied scholarship, whether geographical or not. I had to mobilize an important literature on racialization, imperialism, secularism, feminism, Muslim identities, belonging, segregation, mobility, and fears. First, at the global scale, it is about demonstrating that Islamophobia is a global phenomenon. The spread of anti-Muslim racism, which is more than open and even now legitimized in the media and political discourses, is impressive and globalized in the sense that it is visible in many parts of the world, whether located in the West or not, and in a minority Muslim context or not. Islamophobia also exists in predominantly Muslim countries such as Tunisia or Turkey, and is read as a contempt for religious Muslims by a secularized elite. In predominantly non-Muslim societies, Islamophobia instead follows a process of oppression by the majority over the minority. It can be read as anti-Muslim racism, mainly in Western countries such as France or the US, and sometimes even as crime against humanity in certain countries located in Asia, for example, such as China or Myanmar. And I would also say sometimes as a genocide, like what's happening today in Palestine, in the Middle East. Islamophobia in the West represent the most discussed study area, and it is generally analyzed through the lens of the clash of civilizations, questioning the compatibility of Islam with Western values. Several materials show that the visibility of Muslimness in the West is seen as a problem that intersects with other types of discrimination, such as sexism, for example. All of these contradict the liberal vision of the free Western world, because if Western values respect freedom and feminism, then why don't they protect a Muslim woman who says that she is happy to wear the veil? It is certainly because of the many Islamophobic tropes that have spread in the West, such as Muslim women are oppressed and passive women who need to be saved. And these tropes are used as effective weapons against Muslims, and they need to be deconstructed, especially within governmental discourse and practice. So these tropes have been manipulated to justify the way Islamophobia is legally enshrined in law. Anti-Muslim laws use important values to reinforce the idea that there is no place for visible signs of Islam in the West, like the 2004 headscarf ban in public schools in France, the 2009 ban of minarets on mosques in Switzerland, the 2017 Trump Muslim ban on immigrants in the US, and the recent 2021 anti-separatism law in France, which seeks to reduce displays of the Islamic faith in public life and the separation between communities. This notion of separatism is not understood in the same way in all Western countries. And by analyzing a cross-national comparison between France and the UK in link with the SAMA project, I was able to show two different Islamophobias contrasting the French Republican model to the British multicultural model. For example, I've shown that the UK is less anti-religious than France, which has been at the forefront of implementing laws against religious dress in European countries in the name of laïcité. In the UK, there is no such principle of secularism that governs schools and religious dress, and there are even laws that protect religious diversity, which do not exist in France. According to quantitative data collected from community associations and the metropolitan police in each country, it was possible to observe that in France, Islamophobic incidents are mainly discrimination in public institutions, while in the UK, there are mostly verbal abuse on public transport. So we have two different Islamophobias. These first findings challenged not only French policy fostering institutionalized discrimination in connection with the 2004 law, but also the way British society behaves in zones of contact and especially in urban spaces. And while comparing these two different contexts, I was able to build such a table highlighting the different trends in terms of space, place, victims, functioning, etc. For example, if we just focus on who are the perpetrators of Islamophobic act, we can see that in France it's both men and women, while in the UK it's mainly men. So it's interesting to see those kind of details. At the scale of cities, the study of Islamophobia was possible thanks to the same quantitative data that were geocoded. The mapping of anti-Muslim acts, quite rare in Islamophobia studies, allowed me to highlight specific logics of distribution in Paris and London, showing visually the importance of, for example, the center, the suburbs, transport axes, or specific focal points such as an airport or a privileged area or an area famous for its Muslim populations. More precisely in Paris, the center is the most affected department within the Greater Paris region. Anti-Muslim acts take place more in the center, and the decrease progressively as we move away from this prestigious center. In London, there are as many anti-Muslim acts in the inner London as there are in the outer London. The phenomenon seems more diffuse spatially than in Paris because all the boroughs are affected. But we notice even more the importance of some horizontal and vertical lines, which shows that Islamophobia seems to extend mainly along the major roads of London. For example, a dark horizontal line here shows a worrying level of anti-Muslim acts from Newham to Hounslow. In the inner London, a first cluster appears in the east, where there are several mosques and Islamic centers, as well as large Muslim populations. But there is also a second cluster in the west, in the wealthiest part of London, where incidents generally occur around major shopping and tourist areas and areas with good transport links. These two clusters form a line that extends to Hounslow. So this brief analysis highlights two different urban patterns too. In Paris, Islamophobia describes a center-periphery urban model contrasting the city center and its suburbs, while in London, it rather describes a model which takes into account transport axes in its configuration. This brief analysis, of the geographies of Islamophobia also highlights a clear link to socio-economic segregation in Paris and racial religious segregation in London. In Paris, there are more Islamophobic acts in its privileged centers, whereas in London, even if there are Islamophobic acts both in areas with high and low Muslim populations, these acts are not the same, and they are more prominent in public areas when they take place in Muslim minority areas. Therefore, clear geographical tensions operate in the cities of Paris and London and emphasize areas that seem to encourage the practice of Islamophobia. These behaviors mostly occur in spaces and places where perpetrators feel confident enough to behave antisocially. Indeed, the hierarchy found in the public institutions in central Paris, as well as the dominant behavior of individuals across public areas and transport in which they are in a majority position, certainly encourage such attitude. That is what I found out after interviewing 60 victims of Islamophobia in Paris and London in 2018 with the help of partner NGOs. Here, spatial practices could only be analyzed with the mobilization of more qualitative methods. Victims explain, in line with their own experience of Islamophobia in different neighborhoods, that there are areas where they feel unwelcome and unsafe, and this seriously affects their spatial mobility, which becomes more restricted, especially for veiled Muslim women who are the main victims of Islamophobia in both Paris and London. First of all, in Paris, veiled Muslim women consciously or unconsciously avoid the center. Some explain that they have not been in central Paris for a long time because they have nothing to do there, which is quite hard to believe. Others clearly explain that they do not visit the Parisian center because they feel out of place. As Kenza, a 30-year-old French-Moroccan veiled woman, explains. Not at all. I do not go anymore to central Paris. Not at all, at all, at all. As soon as I can avoid Paris, I avoid it. I avoid Paris because I don't feel at all in my place. I won't go there because of the staring eyes, because of the comments. There, I'm really clearly afraid of being attacked in Paris. I will not venture there. In suburban cities, they feel more accepted and more part of the landscape, in their own words. That said, these geographical tensions between the center and the suburbs seem to reduce when we zoom in on certain neighborhoods and take into account their socio-economic status. Veiled women identify rich neighborhoods both in Paris and in the suburbs where they don't feel comfortable compared to more working class neighborhoods. So it is not so much the geographical spaces that matter, but the socio-economic spaces. In London, veiled Muslim women don't avoid privileged or central neighborhoods compared to Parisian victims. Instead, they avoid non-diverse areas and especially predominantly white areas. They are less comfortable in these areas, and some even mention being scared. This is the case of Mina, an 18-year-old British Somali girl wearing a turban, who explained. If I'm going out and I'm in a predominantly white area, I get scared. Not scared, but you have that fear inside you. Is that person not going to treat me the same? If I were to go to workplaces such as Westminster, it's predominantly white and I wouldn't feel safe. Also, some veiled Muslim women avoid areas and places where there is a lot of bars and pubs because they believe these are places where Muslims rarely go. A majority of them also avoid public transport to minimize any risks, especially following geopolitical events such as the Brexit referendum results in 2016, for example. In the end, the right to appear, the right to the city, and the right to centrality of these women raise questions and, in fact, reveal a spatial exclusion which pushes them towards more familiar spaces, such as their home neighborhood. Their sense of belonging to this neighborhood is strong because it represents a more inclusive and secure space, at least in the minds of these veiled Muslim women. So, in a sense, Islamophobia is first felt and experienced in people's body and mind. Muslim bodies, whether veiled bodies or full covered bodies or beard bodies, etc., develop behavioral strategies in response to anti Muslim reaction. Um, First, Muslim bodies perform strategies of invisibility. They constantly conceal their religious identity by acting as non Muslim in specific contexts. They try to be as discreet as possible in their workplace, for example, especially for French interviewees, like Linda, a 31-year-old French Algerian woman in hijab or turban, who explains. In my former work, I have been looked at as cons. I felt like oppressed. It's like we have to be little mice, actually. Now I have a new job. I've been there for 4 months. I don't speak anymore. It's really something I do now. I don't talk about my religion. I don't say that I go to the mosque. I don't say that I am veiled. Whereas before, in my old job, I was naive. I spoke more openly. I used to say to my colleagues that I go to the mosque. I used to explain what Ramadan is, but now there is a break. I never want to know what I do in I never want anyone to know what I do in my private life, in everything that is related to religion, and all that because it has really damaged my former position. Muslim bodies also try to be less visible through their clothes, especially women and especially French women. They try to manage the wearing of the hijab by preferring a turban instead, especially in public institutions. British women are also careful about how they dress in public areas and transport, but their concern is less about their hijab and more about the type of clothes they choose. As Amelia, a 34-year-old British South Asian woman in hijab or jilbab, explained. If I'm traveling by tube, never ever would I wear an abaya or a jilbab. It would be jeans or anything, just so that people don't feel, because sometimes your clothing really scare people. I'd always keep the hijab on, but I would drop the abaya. Second, in order to reduce the othering gaze, which generally portrays Muslims as strangers and dangerous, Muslim bodies also perform strategies of normalcy by showing that they speak normal, they look normal, they dress normal, and they think normal. They want to show that they are normal and well integrated citizens. And some want to show this some wants to challenge this negative portrayal so much that they go beyond normalcy by performing, in fact, excellency. Muslim bodies actively manage their Muslimness in public spaces where they feel uncomfortable. They are therefore naturally pushed towards more private spaces, such as the home space. But the problem is that this home space can also be a space where Islamophobia manifests itself and where some family members use their influence to dictate anti-Muslim views. This is particularly the case with families of Muslim converts who do not tolerate their conversion, but also with certain Muslim families who can have differing um, interpretations of Islam. In any case, the victims of these more intimate Islamophobia most often try to resist in a non-confrontational way. So here we can see how worldwide Islamophobia spread by the media and political discourse have even managed to penetrate the homes of Muslims and create a sort of intimate Islamophobia that undermines their kinship relations. My final chapter tries to discuss why the spatialized nature of Islamophobia has been little explored by drawing a critical attention to this research gap. I tried to answer this question in three ways. First, by showing that Islamophobia was first theorized by sociologists and political scientists who are only secondarily interested in its spatial realities. And similarly, mainstream geographers are not known to study such a topic because they have always been weaker in exploring discrimination in relation to race and religion. Second, by showing that the use of mixed methods is rare in geography and in social science in general, and by showing that such a combination was essential to connect the macro space of the globe to the micro space of the body. Indeed, this is precisely the use of quantitative statistics that allow me to analyze global, national, and urban Islamophobia, as well as the use of qualitative interviews to highlight infra-urban, embodied, and emotional Islamophobia. And finally, third, by showing that if such studies on racial and religious discrimination are rare in geography, it is mainly because it is a predominantly white discipline. And therefore, this whiteness can raise important questions about the role of racism within it and the great difficulty to study oppression from the perspective of the oppressed, and in that particular case, the oppressed racialized Muslim. This critical gaze finally makes it possible to question the dominant power and knowledge of the academic context in which the geographies of Islamophobia will have to develop. As a conclusion, I can say that Islamophobia is everywhere, and this is exactly what this book on spatialized Islamophobia is about. We talk a lot about everyday Islamophobia. It's a notion widely used in Islamophobia studies, but we don't talk about everywhere Islamophobia. Yet this notion could be an important notion for critical Islamophobia studies and for critical Muslim studies, as Islamophobia is both multiscalar and multidimensional. It is multiscalar as it affects all spatial scales, and it is multidimensional as it affects all sectors and places. That is why we have no other choice but to resist. We must indeed all resist because oppression necessarily calls for resistance. And since some scholars have already shown that everyday Islamophobia and racism need everyday resistance, therefore I can say in the same manner that everywhere Islamophobia needs everywhere resistance. A spatialized resistance that would be both localized and internationalized, as well as a resistance in all sectors. So let's try to invest first the academic world that we know well, but also the activist world, the media world, the political world, the cultural world, etc. And finally, I will add that this resistance must also bring together all global struggles against oppression, because Islamophobia has the potential to go beyond Islam and Muslim identity and create new alliances with broader anti-racist groups, solidarities, and movements that already know the structural dimension of racism, like the Black Lives Matter movement or the Palestinian solidarity. movement. All these fights present a common oppressor, which tries to impose a normalized racist culture and policy. Great activists such as Martin Luther King and Angela Davis have already warned us that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So we have a duty to protect justice everywhere by combating Islamophobia everywhere and any forms of injustice all around this world. And I leave it there. So thank you very much.
Would you like to close your?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Kautar. This was a really very, very interesting and enlightening for me. Particularly, we talk about Islamophobia, and I've been doing Islamophobia research for a few years. But this is one aspect of Islamophobia not discussed much, as you yourself highlighted how spatialized Islamophobia is a very, very rarely researched area. I particularly found it interesting when you said that the geographers or human geographers are mostly white, and in that way, the study of racism is a rare phenomenon. Whereas, interestingly, Islamophobia is studied by everyone. I will stop recording now, and we'll do the question and answer after we stop the recording, because this will go on YouTube and will not include the question and answer session. But